everyone, it's Hailey, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the books that I've read recently. So we are back to the regular recent reads videos. I'm going to be trying to keep the list of books to 5 or 6 books because I know that it can get kind of boring and repetitive if I do more than that. I did want to ask you guys if you prefer if I do these recent reads videos where I go more into depth because it's a smaller list of books so I'm able to talk about them more, or if you would like me to go back to wrap-ups, which I used to do before, where I would be talking about like anywhere from 10 to 15 books in one video, so I'm only able to talk about them for a very limited amount of time. Please do let me know which you prefer so then I can kind of make a decision going forward, but let's just get into this. I did want to mention though, if you are looking to hear about a specific book, I will have the list of books as well as timestamps in the description box down below for you guys. As usual, I will be keeping this spoiler free so you don't have to worry if you haven't read any of these books, but let's just get into it. The first book that I have to talk about is Dear Haiti, Love Alaine by Maika and Maritza. This is a book that was actually written by sisters, which is super cool, but it follows Alaine, who is the daughter of this very successful news reporter, and she ends up having this huge scandal at school. Like, this whole school project goes terribly wrong, and in turn she is shipped off to Haiti to live with her mother and do a school project there. This book is written in epistolary format, so it features letters, emails, all sorts of different things, and that's why it's pretty big. It's about 400 pages, which I feel like is pretty sizable for contemporary, and I did really enjoy it. So I gave it like a 3.5 out of 5 stars overall. There were a lot of things that I liked about it, but there were a couple things that kind of missed the mark for me. I loved how this was written by sisters, and you couldn't tell that it was written by 2 different people. The writing style blended together seamlessly, and I also loved the fact that it was that epistolary format. I love when books do something a little bit different than the typical. It's refreshing and unique, and this one definitely was because it had so many different methods of telling the story. Like, there's a Venn diagram in here, and there was emails, and it just read like you were reading her school project, which was very interesting. So I'd never really seen that done before. This book taught me a lot about Haitian culture, which I loved. It goes into the history and some important people, and you learn about Elaine's history, and she has a very powerful mother who, like I said, is a very popular reporter, and she has her aunt who is one of the most influential people in Haiti too. So I loved that that culture came into it, and in particular, the very strong female characters were awesome. Alaine herself is actually a really strong female character. She's an easy character to root for because she's so strong-headed. She is flawed at the same time, but I felt like that made her realistic. There is a kind of magical element that comes into the story that I didn't entirely care for, so it deals with curses, and I felt like that kind of came out of nowhere, and I didn't exactly love how it was incorporated into the story, so I think that's where my main issue was. There is a romance plotline in here, but I think the main relationship that I cared about was between Alaine and her family, and in particular her relationship with her mother. She kind of has a complicated relationship with her mother because her mother's never around. She's very busy, but she looks up to her so much. Like, she wants to be her mother when she grows up, and she just wants her mother's respect and her, not even her approval, but I guess kind of her approval. It was just a really interesting mother-daughter dynamic that I don't think I've really read about before, and there also was another layer to that that I'm not really going to talk about because I think it kind of is spoilery, but that was definitely a heartbreaking layer to their relationship that I think was very difficult to read about and to deal with for both of those characters. I think overall, while I loved learning about the Haitian culture, I loved the setting and the family relationships and the characters that came into it, I think I was missing more of a solid plot line to carry me throughout the story. I don't know if that's because of the epistolary format of the story, but I felt like it took a little bit for it to get going, and I did love it when it got going, but I felt like I was waiting quite a while for it to get there, and it kind of lacked direction a little bit at times and was trying to do a lot. But I think it was a great story, and I would recommend it. I think it was a really solid read, and it taught me a lot of things that I didn't know. So that is always great for a book to do. So like I said, overall, I gave this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars. And these authors actually have another book that is coming out. I can't remember the title. I can totally picture the cover. This is why I have my books the way that I do, because I remember what things look like before I remember what they're called. But I'm super excited to pick up their next book for sure. Next, I listened to the audiobook for Loveboat Taipei by Abigail Hing Wen. This follows Ever Wong, whose parents end up sending her away to this educational program in Taipei, and she's expecting a really strict educational program, but what she ends up coming across is actually pretty much a big summer-long party. So Ever loves dance, she's super passionate about dance, and her parents end up finding out that she applied to a dance school and they're furious about it, which is why they send her away. I think that this book had a lot going on in it, and I really liked how it handled everything. So there were a lot of fun elements to it. There was a lot of drama going on, but it also explored the immigrant story and how Ever is trying to have a relationship with her parents, and she's trying to reconcile what she wants for herself, but also making her parents proud and what they want for her. And that's something that's really difficult for her to deal with, but you see such growth in her character over the course of this book in terms of how she views herself as an Asian American and how she views her parents as immigrants and how they have brought her to America for a new life. I loved that it was a story about her connecting with her culture, and I think it was super immersive, and she was a very easy character to get behind for me because I loved seeing her learn about who she was and come to some very important realizations and grow up. Honestly, it was very much a coming of age story for her. I think the setting of Loveboat was very interesting. It gave her a lot of freedom for the self-exploration that she was needing, and I think it also offered for a lot of drama. Now, I did have some issues with the drama that was going on. There were certain instances that I didn't very much care for, and I also didn't care for a lot of the resolution. I think that was my biggest issue with this book, was a lot of the resolution felt a bit incomplete and too neat for what was actually happening. That being said, the book did bring about a lot of good discussions and have that drama and intrigue too. It also has a love triangle, which I'm not generally a fan of love triangles, but I did like this one for the most part. I will say it took me a little bit to get into it because I found that the love interests were kind of cookie cutter at times and seemed a little bit like carbon copies, but eventually I did see how they were different and I did understand, okay, like I get it, but I do think that they were a little bit too similar. With the love interest, there also was a solid cast of side characters as well, and I think that the main character and the side characters were all very well developed, so I liked how well-rounded the cast was. Like I said, I listened to the audiobook for this one, and I think that really brought the story to life for me, and I found it to be a very enjoyable listen. I would definitely recommend that. The main reason why I enjoyed this story so much, honestly, was Ever. She was really complex and just a character that was full of passion, and she was the main driver for the story too, so it made it really easy to enjoy. Although there were some ridiculous and kind of unrealistic things that happened and then were wrapped up very neatly, I did enjoy the story overall and will be reading. There's a companion that's coming out soon. I'm not sure who it follows yet, but I am looking forward to seeing who that does follow because I think it's going to be very good. But there are trigger warnings for depression and mentions of suicide in this book, but I would recommend it if those things aren't triggers for you. I think it was really enjoyable and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Summer of Salt by Katrina Leno. This book had been so hyped up and I felt like around like the end of summer felt like the perfect time to read this because it kind of deals with a little bit of witchcraft, but also is set on an island, and I'm glad I read it when I did because I do think it was the perfect time for it. So in this story, we follow two sisters. They are members of the Fernway family, and on the island of By the Sea, you can always smell two things: salt and magic. And the magic is kind of unspoken. No one really talks about it. Everyone knows it's there, but it's never really acknowledged. particularly this magic exists in the Fernway family women. So it's passed down from generation to generation, and by your 18th birthday, you will show whatever your power is going to be. So Georgina, the main character, she hasn't shown a power yet, and they are coming along their 18th birthday. But her twin sister has had the ability to levitate for a very long time now, basically since she came out of the womb. Now on this island, there's also a 300-year-old bird that these girls might be related to, who comes to roost there every summer and brings all of these tourists and all of these like ornithologists, I don't know if that's the exact word, but basically these people who love bird watching to see this bird because she is one of a kind and they are absolutely obsessed with her. Well, she usually brings tourism to the island during the summer, which is what helps the island get by the whole year. This year is a little bit different. This book honestly just had such vibes to it. It was really a cozy sort of like rainy summer day read. I think it's just the witchery of it, but it's also just a very atmospheric story. So it features a female-female relationship. So Georgina is lesbian and she meets Prue, who is her love interest. I do wish that we had gotten to see Prue a little bit more. I feel like she didn't get that much time to be developed, and I would have liked her to be developed just a little bit more. I think the main relationship that I really cared about, that I feel like was developed the most, was the relationship between Georgina and her sister, who I can't think of her name right now. What is her name? Mary. Struggles. So I did love that relationship. I also loved the relationship between Prue and Georgina. I just don't think it got the page time that it really deserved. This was a really short but impactful read. I wasn't expecting it to bring about the discussions that it did. So it deals with rape and rape culture, so definitely trigger warning for that to be aware of, but I think it did a really good job of discussing that. This was a really unique and genre bending read. I liked seeing how it just kind of was intricately woven almost. So it surprised me by how much it sucked me in. I remember when I was reading this, I was reading it at a time where I didn't have a lot of time to read, but every time I picked this book up, I was completely sucked into the story and the world, and the atmosphere of all of it was just so interesting to me, and I fell in love with that because it totally gripped me and I just kept on wanting to read, and every time I had to put it down, I wanted to pick it up again, which means it is a great read in my book. So I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. I loved the witchy atmosphericness of it. I loved this island setting and the bird plot line that was going on, and the fact that it brought about a lot of different important discussions, and the sisterhood and also the romance relationship all were thumbs up from me. I just wish that certain things had been developed a little bit more, but I think it was a really great read overall. Next, I listened to the audiobook for Under a Painted Sky by Stacey Lee. I have been meaning to read a Stacey Lee book for a very long time because they are non-white YA historical fiction, which is very hard to find, honestly, but I'm super excited that I've now discovered her as an author. I mean, not that I just now discovered her as an author, but now I have read some of her stuff and I'm really excited to read more of it because I think that the plot lines for the other ones appeal to me a little bit more. So she is actually a founding member of the We Need Diverse Books Foundation, so definitely this is going to be a diverse book, and it totally was, which was very refreshing. So this is set in 1849 in Missouri, and it follows Samantha, who is a young Chinese girl who ends up committing a crime out of self-defense and then ends up running away with Anna May, who is a fugitive from slavery, and the two of them end up disguising themselves as boys on the Oregon Trail, and they are headed to California for the gold rush. So I talked last time when I was talking about My Calamity Jane about how Westerns aren't my favorite. It's just not my favorite time period. It's not one I know a lot about and not one that I'm generally that interested in, but I did like this one a lot. This once again was a mix of the Western with the journey narrative, which I feel like happens quite a bit because of the gold rush and because that's just kind of what that time period is about. That's why I say that I'm looking forward to her other books because they seem more appealing to me. I like them more than Westerns, though this one I did give a 3.75 out of 5 stars. So I gave it a solid rating. I liked the journey narrative in this one because there was a good mix of action in there, and I just loved Anna May and Samantha as characters. They were so lovable, so fierce and strong, and I loved seeing their relationship with each other develop, and as they got involved with these kind of ragtag peg groups, and it was just a lot of fun to follow them on their journey. And since it did have a good amount of action, even though it did get repetitive at times, it wasn't my least favorite journey narrative that I've read. I loved the author's writing too. There was a great balance of some funny and humorous moments with more intense moments for sure, and then there was also some romantic times too. It had a really good grasp of emotion to fuel the story. I think ultimately this was a coming of age story for Anna May and Samantha. They have both been through so much, and you see them learn about themselves and all the struggles that they face in the world as a Chinese American woman and as a Black woman who's a fugitive from slavery. And it was very hard to read, but it was also very impactful. I was completely rooted in them the entire time, and the story had a lot of twists and turns that I wasn't honestly expecting, and it was just a great ride reading. I think historically, even though I don't know a lot about the time period, like I said, I think it seemed to be really accurate and well researched, and like the author really knew what she was talking about. I think that came through with her writing and through the characters as well. So overall, I gave this a 3.75 out of 5 stars. I thought it was a great historical fiction and definitely has made me interested in more from this author, especially if she writes more characters like Samantha and Anna May. I'm gonna be all over it. Next up is A Song Below Water by Bethany C. Morrow. So this book, we follow Tavia, who is living in Portland, and she's a siren. So this is like, it's a low fantasy, but like mostly it's just a very, very low fantasy. It's kind of hard to describe because it's really a contemporary setting. It reads like a contemporary, but there are a lot of different creatures and classic fantastical creatures that are thrown into it, such as sirens. So Tavia is living as a siren in Portland, which is a place with very few Black people and very few sirens at that. And sirens are discriminated against constantly. There's a big fear of them. So she is living in hiding. She also has her best friend and sister Effie by her side the entire time, and the two of them take on high school drama together until there is this siren murder trial that changes everything for them, and then one of their favorite YouTubers comes out as a siren. This was super unique because it brought in all those creatures and used them as a metaphor. Specifically, sirens are used as a metaphor for the mistreatment of Black women by society, and I loved that allegorical aspect to it. I think it was a really interesting way to analyze some modern day issues that should definitely be discussed. So it's a book that brought about a lot of great discussions. I think it did try to do a lot, and because of that, I think sometimes it felt a bit disjointed and like I was all over the place. Like, even the synopsis, I felt like it was going to focus more so on Tavia, but you do get both girls' perspectives, and both of them definitely came alive through the audiobook. I was physically reading this, but I moved to the audiobook, and I'm glad that I did because I think the narrators did a fantastic job of really bringing life to the characters, even more so than the actual writing did. I'm not saying it was badly written or anything. I think the writing was really good, but I just think the audiobook narration was fantastic too. So like I said, this read completely like a contemporary. It was really easy to read because of that, but you had all these creatures thrown in, and I don't think that they were necessarily always very well explained. I think sometimes I felt kind of confused about what the creatures were and what the lore was surrounding them. I wish it had been explained just a little bit more. I do think that magical element was really cool, but I think the main driving force for this book for me was the relationship between Effie and Tavia. I loved their sisterhood and their friendship. It was just so beautiful to read. They cared for each other so much, and you see that throughout every single page of this book. Like, they definitely are there for each other, and it was such a beautiful relationship to read about. I liked how the greater family relationship came into it as well. That was a little bit complicated, but it was definitely well explored. At times, since there was a lot going on, I was curious where the story was going, and I found that the ending was pretty rushed. It kind of wrapped up a little bit too neatly for my liking and really quickly. I think if it had been dragged out a bit more, I would have liked it a little bit more, but I did give this a 3.75 out of 5 stars. I had a lot of fun reading it. It was different than anything I've ever read before, and that was very refreshing. Now, one thing that I didn't enjoy, I liked the fact that Tavia and Effie use sign language to communicate, but I didn't like that Tavia used a disability as a cover for her being a siren. She used a vocal cord disability that she didn't actually have to explain why sometimes she didn't talk. And I thought that was kind of brushed under the rug a little bit and should have maybe been dealt with a bit more, because I think it kind of was a bit problematic. Overall, I loved both of these characters so much, and I loved what the story was doing. I think it did a lot of it successfully. While I did have some issues with it, I think overall the message like totally got out there, and I think that Tavia and Effie were great characters to share that message as well. So I'm definitely interested in more of what this author might write. I believe this is her first book, actually. Yeah, so this is her debut young adult novel, and I'm super excited to see what else she's gonna come out with. And finally is Maybe This Time by Kasie West. I was not expecting to read this book as quickly as I did, but like I absolutely flew through it. So in this book we follow Sophie, who is working for the local florist in her small southern hometown, and she's at all these events, and at all these events she ends up meeting Andrew, who is the son of this big shot chef who has been catering all these events. So this book is set over 9 events, and it follows the meeting of these two characters and how their relationships develop. Now, I knew it was set over 9 events, but I didn't realize that it actually just goes from event to event. You don't get any of the in-between, but I thought that was really cool. I loved that format of telling the story. I thought it was good. Usually with Kasie West books, I think this is the 4th one that I've read by her, I tend to love or hate them, but this one actually just fell in between. Like, it was good, it just didn't blow me away or anything. It doesn't really stand out. So there's nothing wrong with it, I just don't think I ever really fell in love with it. I don't know if that makes sense. 3 out of 5 stars isn't a bad rating at all, it's just kind of average. So listening to this audiobook, it absolutely flew by, but that was great. Like, I had such a good time listening to it. I loved the aspect of it being set in a southern small town and how the 2 love interests didn't exist in a bubble. There were side characters that were brought into it and were constantly a part of the action. So that was enjoyable, because I find sometimes with romances, they can kind of, it's like just those love interests exist and there's no family or anything else, but family and friends were really involved in the story. I think I just didn't entirely buy into the chemistry between Sophie and Andrew. I felt like he seemed really cookie cutter to me, and I think that might be why I never really fell in love with the story. I liked a lot of moments of it, but there were also some things that just were kind of a miss for me. One of my favorite things though was the fact that it went from event to event, and also the fact that each one, like I love the flower illustrations throughout it, but also each event opens up with a flower. So like we have the Valentine's Day one, and it's a tulip, and it tells you a little bit about that flower. I thought that was a really nice touch, and I wasn't expecting the events to be as different as they were, so I kind of was like, oh, it's probably gonna be like a bunch of weddings, but there's like Valentine's Day party, there's a New Year's thing, there's like just all sorts of different events. There is a wedding, but there's also a funeral and stuff, and that was really cool. Another thing this book did well was deal with the whole like small town versus city. Like Sophie wants to leave her small town, she wants to go to a city, and that's definitely a main conflict of the story, and I liked that there was another conflict beyond just the romance of it. But I just think it kind of like felt a little bit cookie cutter at times in terms of the characters and their romance, and that's why I didn't absolutely love it. So those are all the books that I have read recently, so I hope you guys enjoyed. I tried to be a little bit more quick about it this time, because I know that recently I have been kind of like talking endlessly analyzing these books, but I hope you guys still enjoyed this video, and if you have read any of these books, please let me know what you thought of them, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!